Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first speaker series, actually part one of Dr. Beeman's speaker series. And the speaker series are usually 3 or 4 connected presentations that analyze a larger topic over several months of presentations. So our first speaker series of this year is the Philadelphia Urban ACE Study. And Dr. Beeman is going to look at trauma. She and I were talking a little bit about current traumas in today's world, and maybe we can relate some of what she's going to teach us to some of the stuff that we know exists in the news, sometimes in relation to traumas. So, Dr. Beeman, the stage is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm so glad that you guys took time out of what I know is a very busy day to look at some studies, one of which it was called the ACE study. And just sort of show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the ACE study that the CDC and Kaiser Permanente did? Okay, well then it is good that I'm going over it in this first section today to familiarize you a little bit with what we call the original ACE study. So I always like to start, if you know me well, with a land acknowledgement. And my husband is a farm to table chef, and I was asking him why there's such beautiful foliage in Virginia. Y'all ought to come out here. It's just gorgeous. It was really, really good this year. And he explained to me that there's some trees, and they're called conifers, that work year round. They have a 12-month a teacher contract, and then there's some that work a 9-month contract, if you like. And so what they do is they rest for a few months out of the year. But before they rest, they give a flare of color and brilliance. And the indigenous people that originally settled in what we call Turtle Island in the indigenous culture, which call the United States of America in other cultures, understood the importance of rest. And so we need to understand rest, and especially in the topic that we're going to be talking about, we're talking about no rest, that live in perpetual dysfunction, but they don't see the beauty. So as we're going through, think about the beauty of fall foliage. For those of you that remember it from having lived with it, or would love to come to Virginia and see it, there are periods of brilliant celebration of color, of nature, and then there are periods of rest. And so I'm acknowledging that the indigenous people who originally and continue to inhabit Turtle Island here understand the times. So I am a forensic psychiatric nurse. I'm known to some of you, but to those that are not, I specialize. I actually went into nursing thinking I was going to deliver babies, but I ended up, at least at this point in my life, more concerned about the mental health of people who've been traumatized by violence. I was actually just sharing with Kevin that in June of 1967, I was being bombed in Damascus area, on the Golan Heights area, and in Lebanon. And that traumatized me as a child, as you can understand, and has led to me being very concerned throughout my life about turning victims into survivors. And so here I am as a nurse, and that's what I do. So I speak extensively on trauma-informed care, and I want to present 2 research studies as well as some others that are about trauma-informed care, because I think that those of us that work for Aspen are certainly encountering traumatized students, maybe peers, maybe family members, but we can't help but go through life without the we care about and the people we care for having been traumatized. So what can you expect from this series? We're actually going to take a look at the original ACE study, which it sounds like several of you are not familiar with, that occurred. And I'm not going to be kind to this study. I was telling Kevin, I'm going to sort of take it apart. It has some very, very good information that it found, but I also want to look at it very critically. So you're actually going to come out of this, if you're listening to this presentation, even as a recording, knowing how to dissect a study for its merit, but also for what is it really saying, and what is it not saying? Because it looked at the effects of trauma in children. And then I'm going to present some data on another study. It's a more modern study called the Philadelphia Urban ACE Study, and sort of compare and contrast the two. They did look at some different things. So actually the next preview of coming attractions will be looking at the Philadelphia study. So why do you even care about these two studies? Because in understand the people we care about, the people we care for, the people who are our students, and the people who are working in the booth next to us, often, and they behavior, reactions, motivations, when you understand what they went through as children in particular. So this is what I proposed to Kevin, and he accepted my abstract, is that today we're going to talk about the ACE study, and it looks like some of you are not familiar with it. So I'm going to findings were, and I'm also going to tell you about some of its flaws. And then we're going to move on. It's the 28th of November because there is an Indigenous day known as Thanksgiving that's celebrated where some pilgrims actually came to this country, and they were starving and they were rescued by Indigenous people. And we celebrate the thankful bounty that we have here on Turtle Island. And it happens to be the week that's 2 weeks from now. So Kevin and I talked about it and said, yeah, let's move it to the 28th. That's when we'll take a look at the Philadelphia Urban ACE Study, which is more modern. And then we're going to roll up our sleeves and say, whoa, community violence is a public health crisis. So that sort of tells you what the Philadelphia study found. And then I always like to end on a happy note. So December 19th, I'm going to talk to you about some proposed solutions I have to community violence, as though I could wave a magic wand and make it all happen. But maybe you can come with some good ideas and we can brainstorm some ideas to do away with community violence, or at least mitigate it. So let me talk a little bit about the original ACE study. I'm going to ask Kevin to keep an eye on the chat, because if you've never done one of these presentations before, when I'm full screen so I can read it and you can read it, I don't get to see the chat. So if anything exciting happens, put it, Kevin will let me know. But this original study happened in the period of time between 1995 and 1997. And it was sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control that looked at the time, a very huge insurance company. I don't know if any of you had Kaiser Permanente, but it was an extremely large insurance company. And it had a product which basically said, if you go to these selected providers and you these selected services, and otherwise you have to get permission to have any other service, that was an HMO, then we will insure you at a more reasonable rate than what was the prevailing culture at the time, which was you went in and you got service and then you had your insurance try to pay for it. They actually had over 17,000 participants in this survey, which is a decent amount. And all of the participants of the survey were in Southern California. The focus of the survey was the relationship of child abuse, neglect, household dysfunction to later physical health. So this you'll see the survey questions in a few minutes, but it was asking, when you were a child from birth to 18 years old, how many of these things occurred in your life? And then they looked at their health in relation to this household dysfunction. So at the time, it was a really landmark study of, wow, there's a relationship between the things that I hope you're seeing on the screen and the later illness. So these were the definitions that they had. I'm not going to read it to you because I've seen your names and I know that you're all people I respect and I know you can read it. But emotional abuse, your parents called you a loser and told you never amount to anything and that kind of thing. Physical abuse, where you were pushed, slapped. It wasn't even, thrashed with a belt. It was any kind of physical abuse. And then sexual abuse, where a family member or even a stranger that wasn't like a little kid touched you in an area that you did not want to be touched. And interesting, they focused in on mothers and stepmothers. And if children witnessed their mothers, who were at the time the protector of the household, if mom couldn't protect herself, then the child was thinking, oh my, I can't be protected either. I'm not safe because my mother isn't safe. But it was specifically the word mother. And then substance abuse, or particularly alcohol abuse in the household. Any kind of mental illness in the household, especially if there was an attempted suicide, any parental separation or divorce, an incarcerated member, and then any kind of emotional abuse, neglect, where a child didn't feel loved or physically didn't feel like they had what they needed, compared to other children in their class. So this is what the ACE study asked, and it asked them 10 questions, and you got a point every time you said yes to one of these questions. So of interest, and this is often not discussed, was the demographics. There were 17,000 plus in the demographic, and it was 40-54, which at the time was probably about right, because women like to fill out these surveys, but it was pretty close to 50-50. But let's take a look at the ethnicity. It was 74.8% white, 4.5% black. And even at that time, y'all feel like that reflected the ethnicity of Turtle Island, United States of America in 1995? Very few blacks. Can't really call that a normal sample, but that's what they had. And looks like there's something in the chat.
Sorry, I was answering your question.
Yes. So
that was not matching the demographics.
No, it wasn't. There's a very huge demographic that was missing from this. So now I want you to look at the age, and actually before you all came in, I was discussing this a little bit. Look at the age. Almost half were over 60. So then look at the date. It ended in 1997. So over half of these people were born before 1937. And they ended their childhood of 18 years before 1955. All right. So I think when we look at this study, we think that it's encapsulating children of the 1995s. It wasn't. What kind of historical stuff was happening between 1935 and 1955? Anybody a historian?
Wars.
Yeah, World War II.
World War II? Depression,
economic collapse. Yeah,
economic collapse. I mean, these kids, I don't know how happy a childhood that they
prohibition.
had.
That was the worst of all of them, probably.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, they were just coming out of prohibition at that time. So yeah, remember, over half of those people, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the kids who just survived the fun 80s, right? We're talking about that period of time when we're looking at this. And very few were, look at 9.8% were in their 30s, and 5.3% were 19 to 29. So it's also a very long time since their childhood, right? That are filling this out. Because remember, these are people who could afford to live in Southern California and buy insurance, right? So, there's a sampling issue here. But now look at the education. Do you feel like this reflects? I know we work for an academic institution, and most people around us are college grads, right? And most people we're working with are trying to be college grads. But does this really reflect Turtle Island, where just about everybody's a college grad or has some college?
you know, one thing too, Dr. Beeman, is income. But income probably correlates with education in some way, but you wonder to what degree do certain traumas or other things happening in the home are caused because there are financial struggles.
Yeah.
There's SES, you know, the socioeconomic challenges in the home that then create all the rest of these traumas that are really springing from, we don't have enough money to pay the bills, and now I'm stressed about other things, and so I scream and yell and holler more than I would if the things were happy in a maybe a richer home.
Exactly. And if we're only capturing very rich white people who live in Southern California, are we maybe missing a whole lot of other people? But let me give you the data. Okay. So, and we have a pretty small group, so I really love it if you just chimed in. What strikes you about these data? I'll start. First thing I looked at was physical abuse, and I thought about the spanking generation. My mother and father were from the spanking generation where every kid got spanked. I got spanked, right? You know, but that was the time when you routinely hit your kids, right? That if most of those people were over 60, but 28.3% had some physical abuse in their 18 years.
But is spanking abuse?
It by that definition, it was slapping and everything.
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
You know, remember how they defined it, and so I thought
abuse,
that number was a little low, given that the times, you know.
You're right. We did it in schools. Our principals and teachers would spank us with a paddle.
Yes.
I thought interest is substance abuse because back then it wasn't diagnosed. It was all hidden.
Yeah. I thought that was much higher than I thought. Yeah. You know, the other thing that may not be jumping out at you, but the parental separation or divorce, as though that was a tragedy. How tragic that you're divorced, right? But it was, if you think about that period of time, you know, it wasn't that prevalent. And so it rendered probably the parent, to Kevin's point, not able to make, you know, a living, or she had to go to work, or, you know, they had half the income or something like that. So, you know, had to change where they lived, had to change schools. So maybe it was a bigger deal than, I mean, how many people are divorced now? But they singled it out as a sign of dysfunction to have separation or divorce. And then really low incarceration. I would dare say in Virginia, we have a much higher incarceration rate. And despite the fact that a lot of those would have been during the Depression, only a 9.9% physical neglect, at least among these people. Anything else anybody sees? Like I said, I want to sort of tear this study apart a bit. You know, it has its virtues, and I'll show you the virtues in a minute. But because of the sampling, it also has some things that make you wonder. Anything else anybody sees before we go on? And like I said, I'd be happy to send these slides to anybody because they're absolutely fascinating. And they're on the CDC website. But this was the prevalence by men and women, because men and women had very different roles during those years that we were talking about. So these are the number of adverse events. And just to let you know, 4 or more is considered on this scale something worthy of getting therapy or having an intervention or whatever. So 15% of the women who filled out the survey probably needed some kind of intervention, but only 9% of the men. And 12.5% of the people who filled this out had a significant amount of household dysfunction. And look at the number of zeros. I mean, their parents weren't even divorced, you know, they lived in a happy little household. Interesting, huh? Any thoughts about that?
I was just thinking a little bit, this is all self-reported, right?
Yes.
So some of it could be the interpretation of the person reporting. I might not consider that to have been adverse, or I may have considered that to be extremely adverse, and I had all kinds of stuff going on, and maybe it wasn't really going on. So that'd be the only thing I would think through this. But they had enough people, you would think some of that noise would just shuffle out, and people are, for the most part, accurately reporting the number of
And
incidents.
it comes back to the spanking generation did not see that as
yeah, I wouldn't have ever considered myself to have been abused, but I was whooped a lot. But it was never abusive. I deserved every swat I got, and it was one or two swats. It wasn't like they just unleashed on me with, a stick or something.
Yeah. And so there's a cultural difference in 1995 than in, 1935.
You just
right?
mentioned something too there, Nina's the geographic location in Turtle Island. So in the South, where I grew up, maybe in Virginia too, they still would do it to someone. If they don't see someone spanking their kid, they wonder what's wrong with the parent. Because the kid's misbehaving. Anyway,
exactly.
You're right.
Yeah.
It changes over time.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why it makes it such a really cool study to sort of take apart. So here's the good news about the study. This is what the study found. This is why this is such a seminal study, and my students talk about it so much, is they found that if you had 4 or more on this scale, these are things that followed you into your adult life. Obviously, traumatic brain injury, fractures, burns, okay? But very crucially for people in my line of work, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicide. Unintended pregnancies, pregnancy complication, even fetal death, sexually transmitted diseases, because again, you don't feel like you own your body, that you can, step up and be empowered. Chronic diseases like cancer and cardiac diseases, diabetes, etc. Alcohol and drug abuse, I think Terry brought that up, the substance use disorder tends to follow into adulthood and unsafe sex. And then the lack of education, choice of occupation, and even income, where it's that you called me a loser, I'll always be a loser sort of thing. So any comments about these were the adult sequelae of the adverse childhood experiences? Okay, now I'm going to go to the real important slide. This one, by the way, I posted in my classes this week. What's wrong with this picture? What has changed since 1997? If they did the same study right now, what do you think they would find different?
I think there's probably less cohesive families maybe nowadays, and that's not seen as negative necessarily, but there's a lot of families that sometimes cohabitate, pay bills and etc. But they're probably not this population that we're talking about, which the rich white people who all have medical insurance, by the way. That you already have identified someone who has money in Southern California to pay exorbitant insurance costs, and it's a very specific population. So, but I think those kinds of things, Nina, people living together has certainly changed, and therefore these incidences may be occurring because there's also other people committing them against you now. It's not just your parents.
It could work for you or against you. It could also mean, it could be that crazy uncle's now living with you, but it could also mean that grandma's living with you and saying, don't you do that to my grandson, that kind of thing. So, it can go either way with that. But, and people not having insurance, supposedly everybody has insurance, but maybe not having adequate insurance. Those people could afford insurance. They weren't the unhoused. They weren't, the people that were going from job to job and, that kind of thing. I'd be curious to see what their childhood experiences were and their lack of trust, with people in authority over them. Maybe that's why they are unhoused. Maybe that's why they can't hold jobs. Maybe that's why they, have a lack of access to things, because they simply don't trust people in authority. I think some of you were in my presentation about the little bunnies in the yard, that they just scurry and hide. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to be found. Okay. And so therefore they don't have jobs. They don't have housing. They don't have security because they frankly don't trust the government. Well, who is the government? It's when you're an adult, it's the mother and father role that wasn't really all that good when you were a kid. So then I hopped down on the whole idea of an HMO and who signs up for an HMO. Isn't it today that we're talking about benefits or something, or tomorrow? Who signs up for an HMO versus a pay whatever, healthcare I want, right? Those are people that tend to be okay being controlled by the insurance company. You think that might have been a self-selective of some kind?
I think your last box there, probably, Nina, the one on the bottom right row, is our community violence that we now experience today since 1997. Now, maybe 1997, it might have been Rodney King years where there was some community violence that was provoked by some injustice that was done. But that was considered extreme. And now that stuff happens and it's just another news item. People riot and do all kinds of stuff. And 10 minutes later, there's another item and you've already forgot about it, And so I think these incidences are occurring, and probably social media, I'm sure, has been a layer that has, made things complex in this scenario since 1997, the kinds of traumas that we can experience now. We have constant, media on your phone that's pinging you endlessly with information, and the trauma that can create over time too, just worrying about things that are falling on the other side of the world, but you're never calm.
And you're sort of previewing the reason for the Philadelphia Urban ACE study is, okay, all right, everybody isn't a rich white person in Southern California. So they took it to inner city, urban Philadelphia, asked the same questions and added what you're talking about. What about all the stuff that's happening around you? How is that affecting you? It also is obviously more modern, So that's the study we're going to be looking at next week in anticipation of that's probably more today, then this is a seminal study. I mean, my students talk about this study all the time, and it's very important to realize what we do to kids in their youth affects in their homes, affects their health for the rest of their lives. I get that. But we shouldn't, like you said, negate the importance of what's happening around them also affects their health for the rest of their lives. But I want to go all the way to the end of the first line. They single out divorce and separation as an evil dysfunction in that study. And I will tell you that I think some of you know that my first marriage was violent. And that's why he's an ex now. But my daughters, who are now grown and in their 30s and 40s, will tell you that the best thing that ever happened to them was the divorce, because the divorce ends all the other 9 things, right? It ends all the dysfunction and the neglect and the violence and all that. So divorce is not always a bad thing. Separation is not always a bad thing in a dysfunctional household. And I don't think that study recognized that. It was like, well, if you got a divorce, bang, you got a 1, that's it. That's one of your 10. Versus, and I think some of the courts are even realizing now, whereas I got to tell you, back in the 90s, it was, let's keep the family together, even if they kill each other, right? I think there's more, let's make the family function in a healthy manner. And that was actually a result of the ACE study, where it's like, we've got to have healthy internal functioning, rather than holding on to this, sort of Disney fantasy, the prince, someday the prince will come and everything will just be perfect stuff. It doesn't always work in every household. So we talked about the ethnicity, we talked about the age, and we talked about the high rate of that. Incarcerated household members, I got to tell you, in Virginia, I don't know what it's like where y'all live, but we've got a lot of incarcerated household members in Virginia. As a matter of fact, it's a boon industry here. We import people from other states to incarcerate them here. So it means that a lot of people are touched. They either have been incarcerated, a relative has been incarcerated, they've lost a breadwinner family member to incarceration, or the incarcerated person can't find work and therefore has to live in your house with you, etc. It just complicates things. Are you finding the same thing where you live, or is it just a Virginia thing?
I think it's everywhere, Nina. I've experienced and seen exactly what you're talking about. And I think the damage is, while they're incarcerated, they can't produce things for, and help their family, and it's a burden on their family. And then when they get out, but once they get out, you hit it right on the nail. It's their record now that forever punishes them for, and now they are in a situation it's like they can't get out of, therefore they are maybe, shorter on temper or whatever, and engage in some of these maladaptive behaviors in the household that is being witnessed by children that now are considered adverse experiences, and et cetera. But this person has rehabilitated, but society doesn't give them a chance, and therefore they behave differently than if society had given them a chance.
It's so frustrating because it really should be, using that time, like you said, to mature, to grow, to learn a trade, so that you don't have to lie, cheat, steal, whatever. But then come out. I have to commend the food service industry is really wonderful at giving opportunities to people who've been incarcerated. So again, the indigenous view is that people sometimes walk down the wrong path. We're always willing to take them back into our path, which I love that paradigm. Is not that I'm going to walk down the wrong path with them, but when they choose to come back to the right path, I will welcome them back to the tribe. And I read that once and thought, wow, but we don't welcome back in the tribe. We keep pointing them out, as having been incarcerated at some point. So, and the fact that more women leave those abusive relationships, you saw how many women are even sexually abused, and the whole mother being mistreated thing. I think more women are leaving those abusive relationships now. Divorce is not such a bad word. And I would be curious to see, a more modern study if more women are just getting up and leaving, and they're more empowered, they're more educated, and so they don't necessarily stick around and say, well, that's just part of staying married. Because remember that era that when the men came home from war, they displaced the women. The women didn't have jobs. So you were sort of dependent on staying in a bad relationship, but you were leaving your children in the bad relationship at the same time. So I'd be curious to see a study that, and the Philadelphia study came out with that too, of women who stay and what they do. So, and I think you brought this up, Kevin. People have redefined abuse. Kevin and I obviously have the same parents because they were into spanking, and we call it spanking, and that's just such a harmless term, right? Now it's abuse. It's felony in Virginia. If you hit a child with anything other than your hand, and if you make a fist, you hit them with any object, it's a felony in Virginia. So that used to be called spanking, but it's changed. I mean, the culture has changed, and I do everything I can to tell people in Virginia, no, that's called felony now, but it was spanking when I was growing up. Yep. Well, laws change as culture changes. So,
Dr. Beeman, can I make a comment?
Always. Yeah. I love discussion in my forums. Yeah.
Okay. And I know this may be a little bit off, but, I am obviously younger than those who were the majority in this study, but I did come from a two-parent household, and back in that day, it was fatal to divorce. You know, it basically caused economic disaster. So there were a lot of families that stayed together purely for economic reasons. When I got married and realized that my husband was abusive,
I'm sorry.
I remember the day that I made the decision to leave him. I had a 2-year-old son at the time, and my husband, my first and only, and my husband was busy yelling at me, and we were standing face to face in the family room. And while my husband was yelling at me and I was standing there taking it, I felt something on my leg. Didn't know what it was. I looked down and I realized it was my son hitting my leg while my husband was yelling at me. And that's when the light bulb went off and I realized this is going to pass on to the next generation if I don't get out.
You're very
So
right. And you didn't deserve to be treated that way. And I'm glad that you modeled that you didn't deserve to be treated that way, because you probably saved your son from doing that.
that's
To
the
someone
thing.
else.
And that was the most important thing for me at the time. However, I do want to also let you know, I was shunned by my family for divorcing my husband.
Yes.
So
That was the culture there. And that's why we're having a very open discussion of, we say, oh, you're a black mark if you got a divorce, but you get
right.
9 black marks if you stay. So,
Yes.
I completely understand where you're coming from. Let's not blame the woman on this. This was the culture on Turtle Island at the time. It was what it was, but it isn't what it has to be. And actually, someone came up to me after I spoke once and said, oh my gosh, I've got a 9. How can I change that? Well, she was clearly over 18. You can't change that you got a 9. But I said to her, you can make it so that your children have a 0. And I think that if you get nothing else out of my presentation today, you cannot change what happened to you, Mary, what happened to me, what happened to all of us in the past. We can't change our ACE score. Okay. But what we can make sure is that going forward, other kids have a 0, that's what we can do. And that's what I'm hoping we can do in the next few weeks by really looking at this study. So I've already slipped it. I can't help but talk about the Philadelphia study now that I've torn apart the ACE study. And I do want to say the ACE study at its time was revolutionary because, to your point, Mary, it caused us to really look at our culture. What are we doing to our children if they're in dysfunctional homes? Maybe divorce is better. Coincidentally, that's when I got my divorce, was 1997, because I was having an aha moment that 'tis better to take the family shunning, and I had that too, and get them out so that they don't experience the other 9 things, than to stay in and say, oh, but I'm not divorced, because we were seeing the research that talked about their health. So, preview of next week. No, 3 weeks from now, because of our Indigenous holiday, Thanksgiving. Philadelphia took the ACE questions, but it took it to, instead of white upper middle class participants in California, took it to the other side of Turtle Island, to Philadelphia, to urban participants. And it asked them, in addition, have you ever witnessed violence? Didn't have to be in your house, okay, your home. Have you ever felt discriminated against? Have you ever had an adverse neighborhood experience, been bullied, or lived in foster care? Woo! So that opens up a whole lot of stuff that you're probably saying, well, yeah, that stuff's important, right? Because it goes beyond, did you see your mother slapped or were you spanked as a kid? It's looking at community violence. So I hope that in the last hour or so, I made you aware of the original ACE study, which was a good study in its day, but I'm hoping that you're anticipating the Philadelphia Urban ACE study as a more modern study that looks not just at household dysfunction, but looks at community dysfunction. Then when I shake you up with that, I'm hoping that we'll work together to look at it as a public health crisis. And then, all important, come December the 19th, when we solve all of the world's problems together, Yeah, let's hope, right? At least come up with some strategies about community violence. But if you can't wait to get some information, do know that the CDC has a wonderful website devoted to this CDC Kaiser ACE study, and that the Philadelphia ACE Project will give you free of charge their materials, including their survey. And this is, if you want to take a snapshot of it with your phone, these were the two things that I referenced in this presentation. I'll have different references in future presentations. So that's my contact information, and I'm open to any questions or, comments. This is a forum, so please, everybody jump in if there's, anything that they'd like to share.
Even though I know you sort of tried to tear apart the ACE study, it was pretty innovative for the time, though. At least they asked the right questions. And
somebody was
really,
asking questions. Yeah.
Right. It did lay the framework for where we are today.
And to Mary's point, those of us that in the 90s were going, should I leave or not? It was eye-opening. And those of us that were caring for people and going, why has this guy got cardiac disease at 25? And why is the diabetes rate so high? It did answer that question. So absolutely don't want to take away from the really good findings. I guess what I'm trying to say is we need modern ones. We need to keep up on this. See, Kevin has taken copious notes, so I'm sure he has something to say.
I usually like to share some of my thoughts, but I was wanting to give everybody else a chance if they had anything to say. Mary or Chad, y'all want to add anything? Andre? Okay, you don't have to, but I didn't. Once I start talking, I'm probably going to go on for a couple of minutes. But anyway, I really liked, I thought it was funny that the U.S. is Turtle Island. I never heard the entire continent called that.
Well, and let me explain that, because they believed that there was a giant turtle and that we lived on the back of this turtle shell. That was Turtle Island. It had nothing to do with there being turtles. It was that we live on a giant turtle altogether.
A lot of what we were talking about, or what you were talking about here, Dr. Beeman, is this concept of how what we see impacts what we think and what we do and what we believe and feel by just seeing stuff. Some of that stuff that we were saying were adverse effects did not occur to the person. It occurred to the mom, so it was in the house. And then in the Philadelphia one, once you moved to that, it was occurring in the community. I saw someone else, not even related to me, a complete stranger, get beat up at the bus stop or stabbed on the bus or whatever goes on. A fight breaks out in a grocery store because of your community maybe you live in, and that's the norm, and how that impacts you. I was as an undergraduate, I was a psychology major, and I don't remember the exact professor, but we probably all have heard of this in our intro to psych courses, was the researcher studied something called vicarious learning. And he basically had what was called a Bobo doll, and it was a blowed up inflatable doll that had a weight on the bottom. I even had one of these as a kid. But the thing promotes violence to some degree, but that's what he did. He put this Bobo doll in a room where children were, and they watched someone hit it. And now all of a sudden they wanted to go over, and their levels of violence and aggression towards each other and their, maladaptive behavior totally changed in these children who witnessed this Bobo doll just get punched. They were repeating this. So, this concept of vicarious trauma, I can be traumatized without experiencing the trauma because it happened to someone I love, or the experience was so fear-provoking, someone being stabbed at a bus stop, a complete stranger, but happened right in front of me, and it could have been me that was stabbed, but I ran away. That kind of stuff can then have these long-term effects later in life. You listed out 6 or 7 very, unhealthy outcomes in adults who experience these. And you can't control sometimes what happens in your community. You can't control what happens in your home if you're a child often. You can as an adult and do like what Mary said, and this, I'm not going to, do this anymore and walk away. But this concept of vicarious exposure to things and the trauma and the negative impact it has on us, and it keeps bringing me back to this social media. We are vicariously experiencing whatever we see in our social media as if we're there. and we get worked up from that stuff. I also think it's super, super complex. I mean, you had 12 or 13, 14 boxes there questioning things about, the sample. And I guess we could say that would be the moral of the research story, is pick your sample wisely. Make sure you get a representative sample. It seemed like, only getting some Southern California, financially well-off people is not necessarily an appropriate representative sample of everybody who experiences trauma. And so hopefully this Philadelphia one will expand on that. But I do believe, that it has to be a representative sample, or the conclusions that we draw can be misleading. The last thing that I have here is mixed into a lot of this, whether it be the spanking culture or whatever, and whether or not, you're stigmatized for getting divorced and so on, or you tolerate it, because you think that's the right thing to do, is religion. Religion is all mixed into this stuff. I mean, I grew up in Catholic. There's no way you would get a divorce, and certainly not in the 50s. You have been shunned out of town and talked about behind your back. Well, nowadays it's like people live together and have babies and they aren't even married, and no one says anything, but there's a loving family. And how that's changed, I think, is a gigantic, difference. And even the one you're going to talk about looked like it was in 2013 or something, the Philadelphia. Here we are 10 years later. How much more has society changed, and how much more certain things that were stigmatized and would have been, an adverse experience is not anymore. It's acceptable, and et cetera. So same-sex marriages, you got all that stuff that can be mixed in now that also adds to the complexity of these experiences. We're only talking about probably heterosexual marriages, right? And most of those samples, I don't know about Southern California.
Yeah, it
they
was
may have a little more.
Specifically said mother and stepmother. Why couldn't it have been the father
who was abused or something,
or the stepfather? When I was a brand new nurse, my very first abuse victim was a male. And he was chronically abused. His wife would get paid on Friday night and get drunk and show up at my ER. And not that was eye-opening to me, but it did sensitize me as to how all the materials I could have handed him were about women being abused and shelters for women. And
no one would consider the man being abused because it was a woman who was abusing. So hopefully nowadays that's all changed. But during the days that you were talking about, a man being abused wasn't even a concept. It was only the women who could be abused because they were lesser in strength. Whereas a man being abused, he's stronger. Therefore, he's not really being abused. Maybe he's being mistreated. But anyway, anything else? I don't want to leave anything out, Nina, on what you said. A lot of what this goes down to is the power of the environment. The power of the environment can outcome where we end up sometimes.
That's a lovely way to say it, though, because we can also change the environment. Yeah. So when we get to week 4 and we come up with ways to change the culture, I want you to think back on the culture that we were talking about with okay, everybody gets spanked. Oh, okay, women can't leave. They just have to be abused. Oh, you just have to put up with this. We have changed that in the last few decades. So we can move forward. But let's think about it the next, month or two and see if we can change it.
All righty. Everybody have a great Thanksgiving, and we will see you the week after that for part 2 of this speaker series. Thank you all for your time.
Stay safe. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.